At mile 23 of the Chicago Metro Marathon, when victory was just 3 miles away, 17-year-old Devon Washington made a choice that would cost him everything he'd worked for. The girl ahead of him suddenly collapsed, her body hitting the asphalt like a broken promise. Devon could have kept running, should have kept running. The finish line called to him, along with the scholarship money that would change his family's life forever. But something deeper than ambition made him stop, turn around and kneel beside a stranger whose father owned half the city's skyline. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would prove that sometimes losing a race means winning something far more valuable. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 in the morning, but Devon Washington was already awake. He'd been lying there for 20 minutes, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of nowhere, listening to his mother's cough echo through the paper-thin walls of their Southside apartment. The sound had gotten worse over the past month, a wet rattle that spoke of long shifts at the hospital laundry and too many years breathing in industrial chemicals. Devon rolled out of the narrow bed he shared with his younger brother Marcus, careful not to wake him. The floorboards creaked under his feet, the same boards that had been promising to give way for the past 2 years. Through the small window, Chicago stretched out in the pre-dawn darkness, a maze of streetlights and shadows that held both dreams and disappointments in equal measure. He pulled on his clothes in the dark, a pair of jeans with a patch over the left knee, a hoodie that had once been navy blue but had faded to something closer to gray, and shoes that told the story of every mile he'd ever run. The soles were so thin he could feel every crack in the sidewalk, every pebble, every piece of broken glass that littered the streets of his neighborhood. The left shoe had a hole near the big toe that he'd covered with duct tape, and the right one had lost its tread months ago, making every rainy day a gamble against gravity. In the kitchen, Devon moved with practiced silence. He knew which cabinet doors squeaked, which floorboards would wake his sleeping family, which spots to avoid if he wanted to slip out unnoticed. The refrigerator hummed loudly, working overtime to keep the few items inside. A half-gallon of milk that would expire tomorrow, some leftover rice from dinner, a package of bologna that his mother had stretched into sandwiches for the past week. He grabbed a piece of bread, just one piece, because there were only 3 slices left, and Marcus would need breakfast before school. Devon folded it in half and ate it dry, washing it down with water from the tap. The water tasted of rust and old pipes, but it was free, and free was their price range. Before leaving, he stopped by his mother's bedroom door, listening for the rhythm of her breathing between coughs. Sarah Washington worked 3 jobs: the hospital laundry during the day, cleaning offices downtown in the evening, and weekend shifts at a grocery store that paid cash under the table. She'd been asleep for maybe 3 hours, and Devon knew she'd be up again in 2 to get ready for another 18-hour day. He left a note on the kitchen counter, the same note he left every morning. Gone running. Be back before school. Love. UD. It was written on the back of an envelope from a bill they couldn't pay, in pencil because they'd run out of pens. The August air hit him like a warm blanket as he stepped outside. Even at 5 in the morning, Chicago in the summer held onto the heat from the day before, promising another scorcher. The streets were quiet, except for the distant rumble of the L train and the occasional passing car with music bleeding through closed windows. Devon began to run. It started as a slow jog, his body waking up with each step. His muscles protested. At first, they always did. His calves were tight from yesterday's shift at the warehouse, where he loaded trucks for $8 an hour, cash. His shoulders ached from lifting boxes that seemed to get heavier as the summer wore on. But gradually, as his blood began to flow and his lungs opened up, The pain transformed into something else. Freedom. He ran south through his neighborhood, past the corner store where old Mr. Thompson would be setting up in another hour, past the vacant lot where kids played basketball on a rim with no net, past the mural of Martin Luther King Jr. that someone had painted on the side wall of the laundromat. The image was fading now, the colors bleeding into each other after years of rain and sun, but the eyes still seemed to follow Devon as he passed. The route was always the same, down to 71st Street, east to the lake, then north along the waterfront, where the city transformed into something entirely different. Here, the projects and corner stores gave way to parks and joggers and people walking dogs that probably cost more than his family's monthly rent. But at 5 in the morning, even the wealthy neighborhoods were mostly empty, and Devon could pretend, for a little while, that he belonged anywhere he wanted to run. Lakeshore Drive stretched out before him like a promise. To his right, Lake Michigan extended to the horizon, its surface reflecting the first hints of dawn. To his left, the city began to wake up, windows glowing with early risers, the smell of coffee drifting from apartment buildings that probably had elevators and central air conditioning and refrigerators that stayed full. Devon had been running this route for 3 years, ever since his freshman year when Coach Henderson had noticed him during gym class. It wasn't that Devon was trying to stand out. He never tried to stand out, because standing out in his neighborhood usually meant trouble. But when the coach had them run a mile around the school track, Devon found himself lapping kids who thought they were fast. "You got somewhere to be, Washington?" Coach Henderson had called out after Devon finished the mile, while half the class was still struggling through their third lap. "No, sir," Devon had answered, barely breathing hard. "You run like you do." That afternoon, Coach Henderson had kept him after school. The coach was a small man with graying temples and eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. He'd run track at DePaul University back in the 1980s, before a knee injury ended his competitive career and led him to teaching. "You ever think about running competitively?" he'd asked. Devon had shrugged. Competitive running seemed like something for kids who had time and money and parents who drove them to practice in SUVs. "I got work," Devon had said. "What kind of work?" "Whatever. Pays." Coach Henderson had nodded, understanding more than he'd said. "What if I told you running could pay?" That conversation had changed everything. Coach Henderson had started staying after school to work with Devon, teaching him about pace and breathing and strategy. He'd brought him old running magazines and videos of marathon runners from Kenya and Ethiopia, showing him that the best distance runners in the world often came from poverty, that hunger could be fuel if you learned how to use it right. "Running's not about having the best gear or the fanciest training," Coach Henderson had explained. "It's about wanting something so bad you're willing to suffer for it. And son, you got that look in your eyes." Now, 3 years later, Devon ran 6 days a week. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays were long, steady runs, anywhere from 8 to 12 miles depending on his schedule. Tuesdays and Thursdays were speed work, intervals and hill repeats that left his legs screaming. Saturdays were for recovery runs, easy miles to keep his body moving. Sundays he rested, though resting usually meant working double shifts to make up for the time he spent training. His personal best in the 5K was 15:42, fast enough to get attention from college scouts if he'd been running for a school with a track program and a budget for travel. His 10K time was 32:18, and Coach Henderson was convinced he could break 32 minutes before graduation. But it was the marathon distance that really excited his coach. Devon had only run the full 26.2 miles twice, once as a time trial, around the city, once in a small race downstate that Coach Henderson had paid for out of his own pocket. Both times he finished in under 2:45, which was fast enough to win most high school races and competitive enough to earn scholarship consideration. The Chicago Metro Marathon was different, though. It was the biggest race in the Midwest, with prize money for the top finishers and college recruiters watching from the sidelines. The entry fee was $200, more than Devon's family spent on groceries in a month. But Coach Henderson had found a sponsor, Dr. Patricia Mills, a pediatrician who lived in Lincoln Park and donated to various youth programs, had agreed to pay Devon's entry fee after hearing his story. "She believes in you," Coach Henderson had told him. "Don't make her regret it." As Devon ran north along the lake, the sun began to rise in earnest, painting the water in shades of gold and pink. Early morning joggers began to appear, mostly white professionals with expensive watches and moisture-wicking shirts, people who ran for fitness and stress relief rather than survival. A few nodded at him as they passed, and Devon nodded back, maintaining the polite fiction that they were. All just runners sharing the same path, but he knew better. These people ran because they chose to. Devon ran because he had to. At North Avenue Beach, he turned around and began the journey home. The return trip always felt different, heavier somehow, as if the weight of his real life settled back onto his shoulders with each step. The beautiful lakefront gave way to busy streets, then to his own neighborhood with its familiar struggles and broken promises. By the time he reached his building, the sun was fully up and the city was awake. Kids waited at bus stops with backpacks and attitude. Adults hurried to catch trains that would carry them to jobs that might or might not pay enough to matter. Devon climbed the 3 flights to his apartment, his legs loose and warm from the run, his mind clear in a way that only came after miles of pavement beneath his feet. Inside, his family was stirring. His mother was in the kitchen, still in her hospital scrubs from yesterday, making breakfast from whatever she could find. Marcus, 14 and all elbows and knees, sat at the small table doing homework he should have finished the night before. His sister Keisha, 16, and perpetually angry about everything, stood by the window brushing her hair and complaining about having to take the bus to her summer job at the mall. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Morning, baby," his mother said without turning around. She was frying the bologna, making it stretch by cutting it thin and cooking it until the edges curled up like flower petals. "Morning, Mama. How far today?" 10 miles, she nodded, understanding that this was necessary, even if she didn't fully understand why. Sarah Washington had raised 3 kids, mostly by herself, after Devon's father disappeared when Keisha was 8. She'd learned to pick her battles, and Devon's running wasn't one of them. He kept his grades up, helped with bills when he could, and stayed out of trouble. If running was what kept him focused and hopeful, then she'd support it the only way. She knew how, by not getting in his way. "Races in 3 weeks, Devon said, sitting down at the table next to Marcus. "You ready?" she asked. "Getting there." Keisha turned from the window. "You really think you can win?" Devon considered the question. Winning seemed like such a distant possibility, like something that happened to other people in other circumstances. But Coach Henderson had shown him. The race results from previous years had broken down the times and the competition. "Maybe," he said finally. "Maybe doesn't pay bills," Keisha said, but not unkindly. She was protective of her family's hopes, afraid of seeing them broken again. "No," Devon agreed. "But maybe better than definitely not." After breakfast, he showered in the bathroom they all shared, standing under water that never quite got hot. Enough, and hoping the pressure would hold long enough to rinse the soap from his hair. He dressed for school, in clothes that were clean but worn, his backpack patched with duct tape in 2 places, carrying textbooks that belonged to the school, and notebooks he'd bought with money from his warehouse job. Lincoln High School was a 20-minute walk through neighborhoods that changed character with every block. It was a big school, underfunded and overcrowded, with hallways that smelled like disinfectant and unfulfilled dreams. But it had Coach Henderson, and it had a track team, and that was enough for Devon. In the hallway, he passed kids he'd grown, up with kids who'd taken different paths through the same maze of limited options. Some had found their way into gangs, drawn by the promise of easy money and belonging. Others had given up entirely, going through the motions until they could drop out and disappear into the city's underground economy. A few, like Devon, were still fighting for something better, though they weren't always sure what that something looked like. During lunch, he sat with his small circle of friends. Jerome, who was trying to get into community college on a basketball scholarship. Maya, who painted murals and dreamed of art school. And Carlos, who worked at his uncle's auto shop and could fix anything with an engine. "You nervous about the race?" Maya asked, stealing one of his French fries. "Should I be?" "I would be. All. Those rich college kids with their fancy coaches and training programs." "Rich kids aren't necessarily faster," Devon said. "No, but they get better opportunities, better training, better nutrition, better everything." Jerome laughed. "Man, you've been eating bologna sandwiches and running in shoes held together with tape for 3 years. If that ain't motivation, I don't know what is." "That's what I'm hoping," Devon said. After school, he went to work at the warehouse. It was hot, mindless labor. Loading trucks with packages destined for suburbs he'd never seen, lifting and carrying and sweating until his shift ended at 8 o'clock. The other workers were mostly older men, immigrants and high school dropouts, and people working second jobs to make ends meet. They knew about Devon's running, and they ribbed him about it good-naturedly. "You gonna be famous, college boy?" asked Miguel, a guy in his 40s who'd been working there for 15 years. "Just trying to get fast enough to matter," Devon replied, hoisting a box of car parts onto the truck. "You're already fast. Question is whether fast is enough." That night after work, Devon sat at the kitchen table doing homework while his mother dozed in her chair, too tired to make it to her bedroom. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the street below. He worked through calculus problems and English essays, his mind switching between academic concepts and race strategy, between the immediate demands of school and the distant promise of the marathon. 3 weeks felt like forever, and no time at all. 3 weeks to get faster, stronger, more ready than he'd ever been. 3 weeks to prepare for the race that could change everything, or confirm that some dreams were too big for kids from his neighborhood. But as he sat there in the dim light of the kitchen lamp, surrounded by the familiar struggles of his family's life, Devon felt something building inside him. It wasn't confidence exactly, but something deeper, a certainty that he belonged on that starting line, regardless of who else showed up to race. He'd earned his place through every early morning run, every painful interval session, every mile logged on tired legs after long days of work. He'd earned it through bologna sandwiches and duct-taped shoes, and the kind of hunger that couldn't be satisfied with food. In 3 weeks, he'd find out if that was enough. The Chicago Metro Marathon registration confirmation email arrived on a Tuesday evening, while Devon was hunched over his calculus homework. The notification chime from Coach Henderson's laptop, borrowed for the occasion, cut through the silence of the empty classroom where they'd been reviewing race strategy. Devon's finger hesitated over the trackpad before clicking open the message. "Congratulations. Devon, Washington. Your entry has been accepted for the Chicago Metro Marathon, bib number 847. Coach Henderson leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile creasing his weathered face. 847, lucky number. How do you figure? Same number I wore when I qualified for nationals back in '83. Universe has a sense of humor sometimes." Devon stared at the screen, the reality of it settling in his chest like a stone dropping into deep water. His name was officially on the list alongside runners from universities he'd only heard about in movies, alongside athletes sponsored by companies whose logos he recognized but whose products he'd never owned. The entry list was public, and Coach Henderson pulled it up in another browser window. They scrolled through pages of names, each one representing a story, a dream, a level of preparation that Devon could only guess at. Princeton University Track Club, Northwestern Elite Training Group, Michigan State Distance Squad. Names that sounded like they came with built-in advantages, with nutritionists and sports psychologists and altitude training camps. "Look here," Coach Henderson said, stopping at a familiar name. "Stephanie Laurent, she's the one to watch." Devon had heard of Stephanie Laurent. Everyone in Illinois high school running had heard of Stephanie Laurent. She held state records in 3 different distances, had been featured on the cover of Runner's World magazine, and had already committed to Stanford University on a full scholarship. Her father was a prominent investment banker, her mother a former Olympic trials qualifier. She trained with a private coach who'd worked with professional athletes, ran on an indoor track during Chicago winters, and followed a nutrition plan designed by sports scientists. "She's never lost a race in Illinois," Devon said. "Neither had Muhammad Ali until he did. This is different, Coach. She's got everything. Everything except what you got." Coach Henderson closed the laptop and turned to face Devon directly. "You know what separates good runners from great runners? It ain't the fancy gear or the perfect diet or the scientific training plans. It's what happens when everything hurts and you got no reason to keep going, except that you want something more than you want to stop." Devon nodded, but doubt gnawed at him like hunger after a long run. He'd seen Stephanie Laurent race on YouTube. Videos, had watched her pull away from fields of talented runners with an ease that made it look effortless. Her stride was textbook perfect, her race tactics flawless, her finishing kick devastating. She ran like someone who'd never known want, never felt the weight of other people's expectations, pressing down like summer heat. The next morning brought new challenges. Devon arrived at school to find a crowd gathered around the athletics bulletin. Bored. Someone had printed out the marathon entry list and highlighted local runners. His name appeared in stark black letters, and the reaction was immediate. "Devon Washington's running against college kids," laughed Brandon Torres, a soccer player who'd never shown interest in track. "Dude's about to get embarrassed on live television." "My cousin ran track at DePaul," added Jessica Kim. "She says these college marathons are no joke. These kids train 20 hours a week with professional coaches." Devon pushed through the crowd without responding, but the conversations followed. Him down the hallway. By lunch, word had spread throughout the school. Some students offered encouragement, but others seemed almost gleeful at the prospect of his failure. As if his ambition threatened their own acceptance of limitation, Maya found him eating alone behind the gym, a place he'd discovered offered peace during the chaos of the lunch period. "You okay?" she asked, settling beside him on the concrete steps. "Yeah, just thinking about what people are saying, about whether they're right." Maya was quiet for a moment, her artist's eyes studying the way afternoon light filtered through the chain-link fence. "You remember when I painted that mural on 63rd Street, the one with the kids flying over the neighborhood?" Devon nodded. The mural had appeared overnight on the sidewall of a corner store, showing children with wings soaring above the projects and vacant lots, their faces bright with possibility. Everyone said it was stupid, waste of paint. Somebody even wrote "Dreams don't pay rent" across the bottom in black spray paint. Maya picked at the peeling paint on the step. "But you know what? Every morning when I walk past there, I see kids stopping to look at it, little kids pointing at those flying children and smiling. Sometimes dreams ain't about paying rent. Sometimes they're about reminding people that gravity ain't permanent." That afternoon, Devon's training session felt different. Coach Henderson had arranged to use the indoor track at a community college 20 minutes away, a favor from an old friend who understood the challenges of coaching with no budget. The track was pristine, the surface perfectly even, the air climate-controlled. For Devon, accustomed to running on cracked sidewalks and potholed streets, it felt like stepping into another world. "Today we're working on race pace," Coach Henderson announced, adjusting his stopwatch. 5 miles at the speed you'll need to stay competitive. Devon had calculated his goal pace obsessively. To have a chance of winning, he'd need to run each mile in approximately 6 minutes and 20 seconds, maintaining that speed for over 2.5 hours. It was faster than he'd ever sustained for more than 10 miles, but Coach Henderson insisted it was within reach. The workout began smoothly. Devon's legs felt loose and strong, his breathing controlled. The track's gentle banking carried him through turns effortlessly, and his split times stayed exactly where they needed to be. 6:20, 6:18, 6:22. For 3 miles, everything clicked, then his body began to rebel. Mile 4 arrived with a creeping heaviness in his legs, a subtle shift from strength to survival. His breathing deepened, his stride shortened almost imperceptibly. Coach Henderson called out split times that began to drift. 6:28, 6:31, 6:35. "Stay relaxed," the coach shouted. "Don't fight it. Let your body remember how to suffer." But Devon was fighting it, and they both knew it. His form deteriorated as fatigue accumulated. His shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched. His foot strike became heavy and inefficient. By the time he completed the 5th mile, his legs felt like concrete, and his lungs burned with each breath. Coach Henderson clicked the stopwatch and waited for Devon to recover before speaking. "What happened out there?" "Got tired." "No, before. That what happened in your head?" Devon walked in slow circles, his body cooling down while his mind replayed the workout. "Started thinking about the race, about Stephanie Laurent, about all those college runners." Coach Henderson made a note in his training log. "Fear's a funny thing. Sometimes it makes you faster, sometimes it makes you quit before you even try. The trick is figuring out which kind you're carrying. What kind do you think I got? The kind that's going to make you dangerous if you learn how to use it right." They spent the next hour working on relaxation techniques, visualization exercises that Coach Henderson had learned during his own competitive days. Devon practiced maintaining loose shoulders during hard efforts, keeping his jaw unclenched when lactate flooded his muscles, trusting his body's ability to adapt to stress. "Racing ain't about feeling good," the coach explained. "Racing's about feeling terrible and deciding that terrible ain't gonna stop you." That evening, Devon researched Stephanie Laurent more thoroughly. Her high school team's website featured dozens of photos. Stephanie crossing finish lines with arms raised in victory. Stephanie posing with trophies and medals. Stephanie training with her private coach on perfectly manicured tracks. Her race times were intimidating, consistently fast, across multiple distances, with personal bests that suggested an athlete operating at near-professional levels. But as Devon studied the images, he noticed something else. In every victory photo, Stephanie looked surprised by her success, as if winning was expected, but not quite believed. Her smile seemed practiced, her confidence performed rather than earned. She ran like someone who'd been told she was talented, rather than someone who'd discovered it through suffering. Devon closed the laptop and walked to his window, looking out over the neighborhood where streetlights fought against darkness and distant music drifted from open apartments. This was his advantage, he realized. Not superior training or better nutrition or perfect conditions, but the deep knowledge that failure meant something different when you'd started with nothing. The next few weeks established a rhythm of increasing intensity. Coach Henderson designed workouts that pushed Devon's limits systematically, tempo runs that taught his body to handle lactate accumulation, interval sessions that expanded his cardiovascular capacity, long runs that built the mental toughness required for marathon distance. Each session revealed new layers of his potential and new barriers to overcome. Devon discovered that his natural speed was greater than he'd imagined, but his endurance at race pace needed work. He learned that his mind often quit before his body, surrendering to discomfort that his muscles could actually handle. Most importantly, He began to understand that improvement required a willingness to fail publicly, to push beyond his comfort zone, even when spectators might witness his limitations. The warehouse job became more challenging as training intensified. 8-hour shifts lifting heavy boxes left his legs tired before evening workouts, and the physical demands of manual labor sometimes conflicted with his body's need for recovery. But Devon found ways to adapt, stretching during breaks, eating strategically to maintain energy, using the repetitive nature of warehouse work as meditation time to visualize race scenarios. His co-workers began to take his marathon preparation more seriously as race day approached. Miguel started bringing extra fruit from home, claiming his wife always packed too much. Tony, the shift supervisor, adjusted Devon's schedule to ensure he had adequate rest before long training runs. Even Mr. Patterson, the warehouse owner who rarely spoke to employees, stopped by one afternoon to ask about his progress. "You really think you can hang with those college kids?" Patterson asked, not unkindly. "Guess we'll find out," Devon replied. "Well, you got bigger balls than I ever had. Respect for that." Media attention began to build as the race approached. The Chicago Tribune ran a feature story about local runners to watch, including a brief mention of Devon as a dark horse candidate from the South Side. The article was only 3 sentences long, but seeing his name in print gave the marathon a reality that registration forms and training schedules couldn't provide. Coach Henderson showed him the article during their final track workout of the week. "How's it feel to be famous?" the coach asked with a grin. "Feels like pressure." "Good. Pressure makes diamonds or it makes dust. We'll find out which kind you are." The workout was brutal. 12 quarter-mile repeats at faster than race pace, with 90 seconds recovery between each interval. It was designed to teach Devon's body to handle speed changes, to maintain form when lactate flooded his system, to push through discomfort without losing efficiency. By the 8th repeat, Devon's legs felt like they belonged to someone else. His lungs burned with each breath, and sweat streamed down his face despite the cool evening air. But something had changed since that difficult workout 3 weeks earlier. Instead of fighting the pain, he accepted it as information. Instead of tensing against discomfort, he relaxed into it. "That's it," Coach Henderson called out as Devon passed the 200-meter mark of his 10th repeat. "That's what racing looks like." Devon completed all 12 intervals, his times staying remarkably consistent even as exhaustion accumulated. During the cool-down jog, he felt something new. Confidence built not on hope, but on evidence. His body had proven it could handle stress, adapt to demands, perform when everything hurt. "How are you feeling?" Coach Henderson asked as they walked to the parking lot. "Ready," Devon said, and for the first time since receiving his race confirmation, he meant it. The final week before the marathon brought a shift in routine. Coach Henderson reduced the training volume significantly, focusing on short, sharp sessions designed to maintain speed while allowing Devon's body to recover and adapt. The taper period felt strange after months of high mileage, but Devon used the extra time to focus on mental preparation. He visualized race scenarios obsessively, surging with the lead pack through the early miles, staying patient during the inevitable mid-race lull, having enough reserve for a strong finish. He practiced positive self-talk for moments when doubt would inevitably creep in, developed mantras that could override his mind's tendency towards self-sabotage. "Pain is temporary. Quitting lasts forever," became his go-to phrase during difficult training moments. "Every step forward is a choice," helped him maintain focus during long intervals. "Someone else's success doesn't diminish my worth," reminded him that racing was ultimately about personal excellence rather than comparative failure. 3 days before the race, Devon received an unexpected visitor at school. Dr. Patricia Mills, the pediatrician who'd sponsored his entry fee, appeared in Coach Henderson's office during his lunch period. "I wanted to meet you before race day," she said, extending her hand with a firm grip, "and to give you something." Dr. Mills was a small woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an energy that suggested someone accustomed to making decisions quickly. She handed Devon a package wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside was a running outfit, lightweight shorts, a moisture-wicking shirt, and most surprising of all, a pair of brand-new racing flats. The shoes were sleek and minimal, designed for speed rather than durability, the kind of footwear Devon had seen in magazines but never imagined wearing. "My son ran in college," Dr. Mills explained. These were his. He's a lawyer now, no time for racing, but he wanted them to go to someone who'd appreciate them. Devon held the shoes carefully, feeling their lightness, examining the precise engineering that went into every detail. They represented more than equipment. They were a symbol of belonging, of being taken seriously as an athlete. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for what the gift meant. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me for running the race you're capable of running." That evening, Devon tried on the complete outfit in his bedroom, studying himself in the small mirror attached to his dresser. He looked different, not just because of the new clothes, but because something in his posture had changed. He stood, like a runner who belonged on a starting line with serious competition. The shoes fit perfectly, transforming his stride in ways he immediately noticed. They were responsive and light, allowing him to feel connected to the ground while minimizing the energy cost of each foot strike. During a short test run around his neighborhood, Devon felt like he was flying. 2 days before the marathon, Coach Henderson drove him to the Race Expo, where runners picked up their bibs and timing chips. The convention center was filled with vendors selling running gear, nutrition products and training programs that cost more than Devon's family spent on groceries in 6 months. But it was also filled with runners, hundreds of them, from teenagers to athletes in their 70s, representing every level of experience and expectation. Devon collected his bib number 847 and official race shirt, then walked through the expo with Coach Henderson, absorbing the atmosphere. They stopped at a display showing the course map, studying the elevation profile and noting where the challenging sections would test every runner's preparation. 26.2 miles, Coach Henderson said quietly. "Everything you've done for the past 3 years has been building toward covering that distance faster than you've ever covered it before. What if I'm not ready? Then you'll find out what you're really made of. Sometimes that's more valuable than being ready." The night before the race, Devon's family gathered around their small kitchen table for dinner. His mother had worked extra shifts to afford ingredients for a proper meal: baked chicken, rice, green beans, and cornbread that filled the apartment with warmth and the smell of home. It was a celebration and a send-off, a moment of togetherness before Devon attempted something none of them fully understood, but all of them believed in. "You nervous?" Keisha asked, passing him the bowl of green beans. "Yeah, but good nervous." "What's the difference?" Marcus wanted to know. Devon considered the question while he ate, tasting flavors that would fuel him through tomorrow's challenge. "Bad nervous makes you want to hide. Good nervous makes you want to prove something." His mother reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Baby, win or lose, we are proud of you for trying. That takes courage most people don't have." "I know, Mama. But if you do win," she added with a smile, "we gonna celebrate, like we ain't never celebrated before." Devon went to bed early, but couldn't sleep immediately. He lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of his neighborhood. Distant traffic, music from neighboring apartments, the occasional siren racing toward someone else's emergency. Tomorrow he would run through parts of Chicago he'd never seen, past crowds of people who didn't know his story, toward a finish line that represented the difference between dreams and reality. His racing outfit hung carefully on the back of his bedroom door, the bib number 847 pinned precisely to the shirt. The new shoes sat beside his bed, laces loosened and ready. Everything was prepared, except for the 26 miles and 385 yards that would determine whether 3 years of early mornings and sacrifice had been worth the effort. As sleep finally began to claim him, Devon felt something settle in his chest. A quiet certainty that regardless of tomorrow's outcome, he'd already won something valuable. He'd discovered that his body was capable of more than survival, that his spirit could sustain hope even when circumstances suggested otherwise, that dreams weren't limited by zip codes or bank account balances. Tomorrow would test those discoveries against the reality of elite competition. But tonight, in the familiar discomfort of his childhood bedroom, Devon Washington felt ready for whatever morning would bring. The alarm never got the chance to sound. Devon had been awake since 3:30, staring at the ceiling and listening. To his heartbeat echo in his ears like a metronome, counting down to something monumental. The pre-dawn darkness outside his window held a different quality than usual, sharper, more electric, charged with the weight of months of preparation converging into a single morning. He slipped out of bed without disturbing Marcus, who lay sprawled across his side of the mattress with the peaceful unconsciousness of someone whose biggest worry was a history test next week. Devon's race outfit hung exactly where he'd left it, the bib number 847 catching what little light filtered through the thin curtains. The new racing flats sat below, like faithful soldiers awaiting deployment. In the bathroom, Devon went through his pre-race routine with methodical precision. Coach Henderson had drilled these rituals into him over the past month. Specific stretches to activate dormant muscles, breathing exercises to calm race day nerves, visualization techniques to mentally rehearse the challenges ahead. He studied his reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink, noting the lean definition that months of high-mileage training had carved into his frame. His face looked older somehow, marked by the kind of focus that came from pursuing something beyond immediate survival. The kitchen was empty except for the note his mother had left on the counter. Breakfast in the fridge. Eat everything. We love you. Make us proud. Mama. Inside the refrigerator, Devon found a meal that represented sacrifice disguised as celebration. Oatmeal with real blueberries instead of the artificial flavoring they usually bought. 2 slices of wheat bread with actual peanut butter rather than the generic spread that barely qualified as food. A banana so perfectly ripe it must have been monitored daily to peak at exactly this moment. He ate slowly, methodically, understanding that each bite was fuel for miles he hadn't yet run. The oatmeal sat heavy in his stomach at first, but gradually settled as his body recognized the high-quality carbohydrates it had been craving. Coach Henderson had explained the science. Glycogen storage, blood sugar stability, the delicate balance between adequate nutrition and digestive comfort during extended physical stress. By 5 o'clock, Devon was dressed and ready. The racing outfit felt foreign against his skin, lighter than anything he'd ever worn, engineered for performance in ways his thrift store clothes could never match. The shorts barely seemed to exist. The shirt moved with him like a second skin, and the racing flats transformed each step into something closer to flight than the heavy-footed running he'd known for years. Coach Henderson arrived precisely at 5:15, his ancient Honda Civic coughing to life outside the apartment building. Devon grabbed his small bag of race day essentials, extra shirt, energy gels Dr. Mills had provided, the lucky penny he'd found during his first serious training run 3 years ago, and headed downstairs. "Morning, champ," Coach Henderson said, as Devon slid into the passenger seat. The coach looked nervous, which was unusual. In 3 years of training together, Devon had rarely seen his mentor show anxiety about anything related to running. "You worried?" Devon asked as they pulled away from the curb. "Nah, just excited. Been a long time since I had a runner capable of winning something this big." They drove through Chicago's empty streets as the city slowly awakened around them. Delivery trucks making early rounds, night shift workers heading home, die-hard runners, already out for their morning miles, despite the marathon happening later. The lake appeared to their right, its surface mirror calm in the pre-dawn stillness, reflecting the first hints of sunrise like scattered coins. "Tell me the race plan one more time," Coach Henderson said, navigating toward Grant Park, where the marathon would begin. Devon recited the strategy they'd rehearsed dozens of times. Start conservative, stay with the lead pack through 10 miles. Begin to push at 15 if I'm feeling strong. Save something for the final 5 miles, because that's where races are won or lost. Don't go out with early surges. Don't panic if people pass me. Trust my fitness and let the race come to me. And if you're feeling bad at 20 miles, remember that everyone's feeling bad at 20 miles. The winner is whoever handles the bad the best. And if you're feeling good at 20 miles, don't trust it. 20 miles lies to you. 22 miles tells the truth. They arrived at Grant Park as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and amber. The staging area was already bustling with activity despite the early hour. Volunteers setting up water stations, race officials testing timing equipment, early arriving spectators claiming prime viewing spots along the barriers, and runners, hundreds of them, stretching and jogging and going through their own pre-race. Rituals with the focused intensity of soldiers preparing for battle. Devon felt his stomach flutter as he took in the scene. This was different from his small local races, different from the low-key time trials he'd done around Chicago. This was official, professional, the kind of event that attracted serious competition and serious attention. "Stay loose," Coach Henderson reminded him as they found a spot to set up their small camp. "You belong here as much as anyone." But did he? Devon watched runners from established college programs warming up with coordinated team uniforms and matching gear bags. He observed athletes with personal coaches providing last-minute technical advice and encouragement. He noticed the easy confidence of competitors who'd grown up assuming they deserved to be on starting lines like this one. Stephanie Laurent arrived at 6:30 with an entourage that seemed to occupy half the elite athlete area. Her private coach carried a sophisticated tablet displaying what appeared to be real-time weather data and pacing calculations. Her parents wore matching team shirts with Laurent Elite printed across the chest. A photographer documented her pre-race preparations as if each stretch and stride was historically significant. Devon watched her warm-up routine from a distance, noting the technical precision of her movement patterns. She looked exactly like what she was, an athlete who'd been groomed for success from an early age, whose natural talent had been amplified by every advantage money and connections could provide. Her stride was textbook perfect, her confidence absolute, her preparation thorough to the point of intimidation. "Stop staring," Coach Henderson said quietly. "She's fast, but she ain't you. She doesn't know what you know about fighting for something." "What if that doesn't matter? What if good coaching and perfect nutrition beat hunger and determination? Then you'll find out, but I doubt it. Hunger makes you dangerous in ways comfort never can." At 7 o'clock, race officials began calling runners to the starting line. The elite athletes were positioned at the front, their bib numbers marking them as serious competitors worthy of prime real estate. Devon found his place in the second row, close enough to the leaders to avoid getting trapped behind slower runners, far enough back to avoid the dangerous early race surging that often claimed ambitious but inexperienced marathoners. The crowd was larger than he'd expected. Thousands of spectators lined the barriers despite the early hour, many holding signs supporting specific runners or simply encouraging anyone willing to attempt the distance. Devon scanned the faces, looking for his family, knowing they were somewhere in the crowd, but unable to locate them among the sea of strangers. "Runners, prepare for the start!" announced the race director through a crackling PA system. Devon's heart rate spiked as adrenaline flooded his system. This was it, the moment 3 years of preparation had been building toward. 26 miles and 385 yards between him and the answer to questions he'd been asking since Coach Henderson first suggested he was capable of something special. He closed his eyes and ran through his mental checklist one final time. Body felt loose and strong, stomach settled and comfortable, mind clear and focused, racing flats responsive beneath his feet. Everything was as ready as months of careful preparation could make it. 30 seconds, called the starter. The crowd of runners pressed forward slightly, everyone eager to begin the journey they'd trained so long to attempt. Devon found himself surrounded by athletes from universities he'd only read about, runners whose race times he'd memorized, competitors whose success stories had motivated his own training during the darkest moments of doubt. 10 seconds. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of hundreds of people breathing in rhythm, hearts beating in anticipation, minds preparing for the controlled suffering that defined marathon racing. Runners. Set. Devon bent slightly at the waist, weight balanced on the balls of his feet, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring waiting for release. The starter's pistol cracked across Grant Park like thunder. The field surged forward. As one organism, hundreds of individual ambitions, merging into a river of motion that flowed away from the starting line and into the Chicago streets. Devon settled into the pace immediately, his body remembering the rhythm of race tempo running, his mind automatically calculating split times and effort levels. The first mile felt almost easy, carried by adrenaline and the energy of the crowd. Spectators lined both sides of the street, their cheers creating a tunnel of sound that seemed to pull the runners forward. Devon found himself in exactly the position he'd planned, close enough to the leaders to respond to moves, relaxed enough to save energy for the challenges ahead. His first mile split was perfect, 6 minutes and 18 seconds, exactly where Coach Henderson had told him to be. The early pace felt controlled and sustainable, though Devon knew the real test wouldn't come for another hour of running. Stephanie Laurent looked effortless at the front of the pack, her stride so mechanically efficient it barely seemed like work. She ran with the calm confidence of someone who'd never doubted the outcome, whose preparation had been so thorough that race day was simply an opportunity to demonstrate inevitable superiority. But Devon noticed something else as they passed. The 2-mile marker, several of the college runners were breathing harder than they should be so early in the race. The excitement and adrenaline that made the first miles feel easy could also seduce runners into unsustainable paces, borrowing speed from later miles when every second would be desperately needed. Patience, he reminded himself, settling deeper into his planned rhythm. The course wound through downtown Chicago, past landmarks Devon had seen countless times, but never from this perspective. The Willis Tower loomed overhead like a giant's monument to ambition. The Chicago River reflected the morning sun in patterns that seemed to dance with their movement. Streets he'd walked to job interviews and school events now served as the stage for his greatest athletic challenge. By mile 5, the field had begun to string out naturally. The initial pack of 20 lead runners had separated into smaller groups based on fitness, tactics, and early race decision-making. Devon found himself in a chase group of 6 runners, about 30 seconds behind Stephanie Laurent and 2 other leaders who'd established a steady gap through consistent pressure. His splits remained exactly where they needed to be: 6:19, 6:17, 6:20, 6:18. The consistency was intentional, the result of hundreds of training runs where Coach Henderson had taught him to trust his internal clock and resist the temptation to race the early miles. "How are you feeling?" asked the runner beside him, a tall kid from Northwestern University whose team singlet suggested serious training and institutional support. "Good," Devon replied, though he was surprised by the question. Most elite runners avoided conversation during races, preserving energy and maintaining focus. "You're the guy from the South Side, right? Read about you in the Tribune." Devon nodded, unsure whether the recognition was encouraging or added pressure he didn't need. "Respect, man. Takes balls to line up with this field." They ran in companionable silence after that, two athletes sharing the strange intimacy of pursuing excellence together while ultimately competing against each other. Devon found the interaction oddly comforting, evidence that running could transcend the social and economic divisions that separated them in every other context. The halfway point arrived faster than expected, marked by a timing mat and a cluster of race officials calling out split times. Devon's half-marathon time was 1:22:47, exactly on pace for his goal of finishing under 2:45. More importantly, he felt strong and controlled, as if the first 13 miles had been an extended warm-up for the real race that would begin in the second half. Stephanie Laurent passed the halfway mark 35 seconds ahead, still looking relaxed, but no longer pulling away. The gap had stabilized, suggesting that her early advantage might represent tactical positioning rather than superior fitness. Devon felt a flicker of possibility, not confidence exactly, but the recognition that the race remained undecided. "Perfect," Coach Henderson called out from the crowd as Devon passed. "Stay patient. Let them come back to you." The words penetrated the fog of concentration that marathon racing induced, reminding Devon that he wasn't alone in this effort. Somewhere in the crowd were his family members who'd sacrificed sleep and work schedules to watch him chase a dream. They didn't fully understand, but completely supported. Behind him stood 3 years of early mornings and difficult workouts, of choosing delayed gratification over immediate comfort, of believing that where you started didn't determine where you could finish. Mile 15 brought the first serious challenge. The course included a gradual climb that wouldn't register as a hill in any geographic sense, but felt like a mountain after an hour of sustained effort. Several runners in his group began to fade, as the incline demanded reserves they'd spent too freely in the early miles. Devon, conditioned by years of running Chicago's unforgiving streets, barely noticed the elevation change. His form remained relaxed, his breathing steady, his stride unchanged. For the first time in the race, he began to pass runners rather than simply maintaining position. By mile 16, he was in 4th place. By mile 17, he was 3rd. At mile 18, only Stephanie Laurent and one other runner remained ahead of him, and the gap was closing with each step. The crowds along the course had thickened as the morning progressed, creating walls of sound that seemed to push him forward. Signs with his name appeared sporadically, evidence that word of his story had spread among Chicago's running community. "Go Devon! South Side speed! Prove them wrong!" Each encouraging shout felt like additional fuel, converting the energy of strangers into forward momentum. Devon had never experienced anything like it, the sensation of an entire city willing him toward success, of representing something larger than his individual ambition. At mile 20, the mathematics of marathon racing shifted dramatically. This was where Coach Henderson had warned him the real competition would begin, where superior preparation separated dreamers from achievers, where the race would be won or lost based on who had been most honest about their training over the preceding months. Devon's legs felt heavy for the first time, his stride slightly labored, his breathing deeper than it had been through the first hour and a half. But these sensations felt manageable, expected, like discomfort he'd experienced and overcome during countless long training runs. More importantly, the runner in 2nd place, a kid from University of Michigan whose early confidence had carried him through the first half, was visibly struggling. His form had deteriorated noticeably, his pace slowing with each passing mile marker. At mile 21, Devon moved into 2nd place. Ahead of him, Stephanie Laurent continued to run with mechanical precision, but something in her posture suggested the effort was no longer effortless. Her shoulders carried tension that hadn't been there earlier, and her stride had shortened almost imperceptibly. For the first time since the race began, Devon allowed himself to consider the possibility of victory, not as a distant fantasy, but as a realistic outcome based on current evidence. He was closing the gap steadily, felt stronger than anyone around him, and had carefully managed his energy reserves for exactly this scenario. At mile 22, he was 15 seconds behind the leader. At mile 23, the gap was 10 seconds. The crowd noise had become deafening, thousands of voices merging into a roar that seemed to lift him off the pavement. Devon could see Stephanie Laurent clearly now, could observe the subtle signs of fatigue that experience had taught him to recognize. The slight forward lean that indicated labored breathing, the arm carriage that suggested muscular tension, the stride frequency that had increased to compensate for diminishing power. She was vulnerable. Devon was ready to strike. The moment had arrived that would define everything, not just the outcome of this race, but the trajectory of his future, the vindication of every sacrifice his family had made, the proof that dreams weren't limited by circumstances of birth. He moved to the left side of the course, positioning himself for the surge that would either carry him to victory or reveal the limits of his preparation. Every step forward was a choice, every breath a commitment to pursuing excellence regardless of the cost. Victory was 1 mile away, mile 23.5. Devon pulled alongside Stephanie Laurent for the first time in the race. She turned, her head slightly, acknowledging his presence with the kind of surprised recognition reserved for competitors who weren't supposed to be there. Her breathing was labored now, no longer the controlled rhythm that had carried her through the first 20 miles. Sweat darkened her team singlet despite the cool morning air, and her stride had developed a subtle hitch that suggested her body was negotiating with muscles that wanted to quit. "Strong race," she managed between breaths, offering the kind of respectful nod that serious runners exchanged when pushing each other toward excellence. Devon didn't respond immediately, conserving energy for what he sensed would be the decisive moment. But something in her acknowledgement, the genuine respect rather than dismissive surprise, made him appreciate the competitive spirit that transcended their vastly different backgrounds. They ran together for perhaps 30 seconds, matching each other stride for stride, two athletes operating at the absolute limit of their preparation. The crowd noise had reached a crescendo, thousands of spectators recognizing they were witnessing something special, a dead heat between competitors who represented different worlds but shared the same relentless pursuit of speed. Then Devon made his move. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. Marathon racing rarely allowed for explosive surges after 23 miles of sustained effort. Instead, he gradually increased his turnover rate, lengthening his stride just enough to open a gap that psychology would amplify into decisive separation. His body responded as if it had been waiting for this moment, finding reserves that months of careful training had built and preserved for exactly this scenario. Stephanie tried to match the acceleration, but her form betrayed the struggle. Her shoulders rose toward her ears, her jaw clenched with visible tension, her stride frequency increased without corresponding power. She was fighting her body rather than working with it, and the mathematics of endurance athletics don't forgive such battles. By mile 24, Devon led by 3 seconds. At 24.5, the gap was 8 seconds. Victory felt inevitable now, not because the distance remaining was insignificant, but because Devon could sense the shift in competitive dynamics that often determined marathon outcomes. He was getting stronger as Stephanie weakened, pulling away with the kind of steady pressure that breaks spirits as efficiently as it breaks contact. The course curved left around a small park, temporarily shielding the runners from the main crowd. In this quieter section, Devon could hear his own breathing, his footsteps on the asphalt, the distant sound of spectators cheering for runners still scattered across the 26-mile course. Everything felt crystalline and focused, as if his entire world had condensed to the simple act of moving forward as efficiently as possible. He passed the 25-mile marker with a lead of 12 seconds, close enough to hear Stephanie's labored breathing behind him, but far enough ahead to control the race's final chapter. His legs felt heavy but strong, tired but not broken, carrying him toward a finish line that would validate everything he'd believed about the relationship between determination and circumstance. Then, at mile 25.3, everything changed. The sound reached him first, a sharp cry followed by the unmistakable noise of a body hitting pavement hard. Devon's peripheral vision caught the flash of movement as Stephanie Laurent collapsed onto the road surface, her legs simply ceasing to function as exhaustion and dehydration converged into complete system failure. Devon's first instinct was to continue running. This was competition, after all, and athletes collapsed in endurance events with unfortunate regularity. Race officials and medical personnel existed specifically to handle such situations. He was less than a mile from achieving something that would transform his life and his family's future. Victory was no longer a possibility, but a probability that required only 13 more minutes of sustained effort. But as he ran past her, prone form, something made him glance back. Stephanie Laurent lay on her side, completely motionless. Not the controlled collapse of an athlete who'd simply pushed beyond their limits, but the boneless stillness of someone whose body had shut down entirely. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested serious medical distress, and her breathing appeared shallow and irregular. More concerning was the absence of immediate help. The medical station that should have been positioned near the 25-mile marker was empty. A folding chair and unmanned supply table were the only evidence that support personnel had ever been there. The nearest spectators were 50 yards away, cheering for runners who hadn't yet reached the crisis point, oblivious to the emergency unfolding behind them. Devon slowed to a jog, then stopped completely. Everything he'd worked for lay ahead of him: the finish line, the victory, the scholarship opportunities that would lift his entire family out of poverty. Behind him lay a competitor who'd grown up with every advantage he'd been denied, who'd trained with resources he could never access, who represented a world that had never welcomed kids from his neighborhood. The logical choice was obvious. Continue running, win the race, claim the future that 3 years of sacrifice had earned. Instead, Devon turned around. He reached Stephanie Laurent in 4 quick strides, immediately assessing her condition with the basic first aid knowledge Coach Henderson had insisted he learn. Her pulse was rapid and thready, her breathing shallow, her skin hot and dry despite the cool air. Classic signs of severe heat exhaustion progressing toward heat stroke. A medical emergency that could cause permanent organ damage or death if not treated immediately. "Hey," he said, kneeling beside her and gently touching her shoulder. "Can you hear me?" No response. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something beyond the physical world around them. Devon looked around desperately for help. The nearest medical station was at least a quarter-mile back, based on his memory of the course map. The few spectators in the area were too far away to have witnessed the collapse, and the runners behind them were still several minutes away at their current pace. He was alone with a medical emergency that required immediate intervention. Devon slipped his arms under Stephanie's shoulders and knees, lifting her in a motion that sent immediate shockwaves through his already fatigued legs. She was taller than him and completely limp, making her an awkward burden for someone who'd already run 25 miles at race pace. But adrenaline provided strength that his glycogen-depleted muscles couldn't generate on their own. He began moving back toward the medical station they'd passed a quarter-mile earlier, each step a negotiation between urgency and exhaustion. His quadriceps screamed in protest, his lower back seized with the unfamiliar load, and his cardiovascular system tried to process the conflicting demands of carrying additional weight while maintaining forward momentum. Other runners began passing him now, competitors who'd been minutes behind suddenly moving ahead as Devon reversed direction with his unconscious burden. Each passing athlete represented a position lost, a time goal abandoned, a dream deferred for someone who'd never know his name or understand his sacrifice. "Medical emergency ahead," he called out to the passing runners, hoping someone would alert race officials or redirect help toward their location. Most nodded grimly and continued running, understanding that stopping would compromise their own months of preparation without necessarily providing useful assistance. A few looked back with expressions that mixed concern with gratitude that the crisis belonged to someone else. The quarter-mile back to the medical station felt longer than any distance Devon had ever covered. Stephanie Laurent remained unconscious. In his arms, her breathing growing more labored with each passing minute. Devon's own body began to rebel against the demands he was placing on it. Muscles that had been asked to sustain pace for 25 miles, now forced to carry additional weight in the opposite direction from their intended goal. By the time he reached the medical station, Devon's legs were trembling with fatigue, and his lungs burned with effort that had nothing to do with efficient forward motion. 2 EMTs looked up in surprise as he approached, clearly not expecting runners to be moving backward on the course. "Heat stroke," Devon gasped, gently lowering Stephanie onto the medical cot they quickly prepared. "She's been unconscious for about 5 minutes. Pulse is fast, breathing shallow, skin's hot and dry." The medical personnel immediately began treatment protocols. Intravenous fluids, cooling packs applied to her neck and wrists, continuous monitoring of vital signs. Their professional efficiency transformed what had been an emergency into a manageable medical situation. But Devon could see in their faces that his quick response had likely prevented a much more serious outcome. "You probably saved her life," one of the EMTs said quietly as they worked. "Heat stroke can cause permanent brain damage if not treated immediately." Devon nodded, but the satisfaction of that knowledge was complicated by the growing awareness of what his choice had cost. Other runners continued streaming past the medical station, each one representing positions he'd lost in pursuit of his own goals. The clock continued ticking toward times that would determine scholarship opportunities, racing futures, and the transformation of his family's circumstances. "You should get back out there," the other EMT said, noticing Devon's race. Bib and recognizing the conflict he must be experiencing. "We've got her stabilized. There's nothing more you can do here." Devon looked at Stephanie Laurent, whose color was already improving as the medical intervention took effect. Her breathing had stabilized, and the grayish pallor was giving way to more normal skin tone. She would recover completely, return to her elite training program, and probably never remember the critical minutes when her life had hung in the balance. He looked toward the course, where the finish line waited less than a mile away. Victory was no longer possible. Too many runners had passed during his rescue mission, but a strong finish remained achievable. He could still salvage something from the day, still prove his competitive worthiness even if the ultimate prize had slipped away. But as Devon prepared to return to the race, Stephanie Laurent's eyes fluttered open. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice weak but coherent. "You collapsed," Devon said, kneeling beside the medical cot. "Heat stroke. You're going to be okay." She focused on his face with obvious effort, recognition dawning slowly. "You were winning. You were ahead of me." "Yeah." "And you stopped." "Yeah." "Stephanie." Laurence stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression that had nothing to do with medical recovery. Why? Devon considered the question, surprised to find he didn't have a ready answer. Why had he stopped? Why had he sacrificed months of preparation for someone who'd grown up with every advantage he'd been denied? Why had he chosen compassion over competition when the stakes were higher than they'd ever been in his life? Because it was the right thing to do, he said finally. Tears gathered in Stephanie's eyes, not from physical pain, but from something deeper and more complex. I don't know if I would have done the same thing. You never know until you're there, Devon replied, echoing words Coach Henderson had spoken to him countless times. One of the EMTs interrupted the conversation. We need to get her to the hospital for observation. And you, he said to Devon, need to decide whether you're finishing this race. You've been stationary for almost 10 minutes. Devon stood slowly, his legs stiff from the extended break and the unfamiliar exertion of carrying another person. The finish line waited, no longer offering victory, but still representing completion, still honoring the months of sacrifice that had brought him to this moment. Go, Stephanie said firmly. Finish what you started. Devon nodded once, then began jogging back toward the course. His legs felt foreign after the extended interruption, his rhythm completely disrupted by the break-in forward momentum. But gradually, as his body remembered the motion of racing, something like his original pace returned. He rejoined the course to find himself surrounded by runners he'd passed hours earlier, competitors whose steady pacing had ultimately proven more valuable than his early speed. They glanced at him curiously, recognizing his race number from earlier in the event, but unable to explain his sudden reappearance among the middle of the pack. Devon didn't try to explain. He simply settled into the strongest pace his legs could sustain and focused on the finish line that represented something different now than it had when he'd left it behind. The final half-mile felt both eternal and instantaneous, his legs moving through motions that memory sustained when conscious began to falter. Spectators lined the course barriers, their cheers creating a tunnel of sound that carried him forward despite the weight of exhaustion and disappointment that threatened to overwhelm his remaining reserves. At 400 meters from the finish, Devon began his final surge. Not because he was competing for position anymore, but because finishing strong felt like the only way to honor everything that had brought him to this moment. His legs responded with surprising power, finding speed that should have been impossible after 26 miles, and the additional stress of his rescue mission. At 200 meters, he passed 3 runners who'd been ahead of him. At 100 meters, he passed 2 more, and as he crossed the finish line, Devon Washington completed the Chicago Metro Marathon with a time that, while not victorious, represented something more valuable than any medal could provide. He'd run 26.2 miles in 2:47:23, finishing in 7th place overall. But more importantly, he'd discovered that sometimes the most significant victories had nothing to do with crossing finish lines first. The medal felt heavier than it should have as the volunteer slipped it around Devon's neck. 7th place in the Chicago Metro Marathon, a time and finish that would have thrilled him 6 months ago, but now carried the weight of what might have been. The bronze-colored disc caught the afternoon sunlight as Devon walked through the finishers area, his legs moving on autopilot while his mind processed the complex emotions swirling through his exhausted consciousness. Devon Washington. A reporter from Chicago Running Magazine appeared beside him, digital recorder extended and questions ready. Can you talk about what happened out there? We heard you stop to help another runner. Devon paused, surprised by the attention. In his mental preparation for race day, he'd imagined post-race interviews only in the context of victory. Being questioned about 7th place felt surreal, as if his story had somehow become newsworthy. Despite falling short of its intended conclusion, Stephanie Laurent collapsed at mile 25, he said simply. She needed help. But you were in position to win. You had the lead with less than a mile to go. She could have died. The reporter's expression shifted, recognizing they were documenting something more complex than typical race coverage. What went through your mind when you made the decision to stop? Devon considered the question while volunteer medical staff checked his vital signs and offered him fluids and recovery snacks. What had gone through his mind? In the moment, there hadn't been time for extended analysis, just the immediate recognition that someone's life mattered more than his own competitive ambitions. Didn't really think about it, he said finally. Just did what needed doing. Are you disappointed about losing the race? Devon looked toward the finish line, where other runners were still arriving, each one completing their own journey of 26 miles and 385 yards. Some were celebrating personal victories, others struggling with the gap between expectations and reality. All of them had chosen to attempt something difficult, to test themselves against a distance that demanded months of preparation and hours of sustained suffering. Can't lose something that was never guaranteed, he replied. I ran the race I was supposed to run. After the reporter moved on to find other stories, Devon found himself alone in the recovery area, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a major marathon finish. Massage therapists worked on cramping muscles, nutritionists distributed recovery foods, photographers captured the exhausted joy of athletes who'd completed something they'd trained months to attempt. Coach Henderson appeared. Through the crowd, his weathered face carrying an expression Devon couldn't immediately read. Pride mixed with disappointment, satisfaction combined with frustration, the complex emotional response of a mentor whose athlete had both exceeded and fallen short of expectations in the same race. How are you feeling? The coach asked, settling beside Devon on a folding chair that creaked under his weight. Tired, confused, I don't know. Confused about what? Devon gestured toward the finish line, where spectators were still cheering for arriving runners. Everything. Whether I did the right thing, whether it was worth it, whether I'm stupid for throwing away the biggest opportunity I'll ever get. Coach Henderson was quiet for a moment, watching the steady stream of finishers cross the timing. Mats, a woman in her 60s, raised her arms in celebration as she completed what was obviously her first marathon. A college runner collapsed in exhausted relief after achieving a personal best. Two friends crossed hand in hand, their matching shirts indicating they'd trained together for this shared goal. You know what I see when I look at that finish line, the coach said finally. What? Hundreds of people who started something difficult and refused to quit. That's what marathons really measure, not speed, but stubbornness. The willingness to keep moving forward when everything in your body wants to stop. I stopped. No, you redirected. Big difference. Devon pulled the mylar space blanket tighter around his shoulders, the metallic material crinkling with each movement. His body temperature was dropping as the adrenaline wore off, leaving him shivering despite the warm afternoon air. What happens now? He asked. Now you recover. Now you figure out what this race taught you. Now you decide whether you want to run another one, another marathon, another anything. College, career, life, they're all endurance events. Today you learned something about who you are when the stakes are highest. That knowledge is worth more than any medal. Before Devon could respond, a commotion near the medical tent caught their attention. An ambulance was departing, presumably carrying Stephanie Laurent to the hospital for observation. But standing beside the tent, very much conscious and looking significantly better than she had during her collapse, was a woman Devon didn't recognize. She was perhaps 40 years old, impeccably dressed, despite being at a running event, carrying herself with the kind of authority that suggested significant responsibility in whatever world she normally inhabited. Her eyes scanned the recovery area methodically, as if searching for something specific. "Excuse me," she said, approaching Devon with purposeful strides. "Are you Devon Washington?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm Catherine Laurent, Stephanie's mother." She extended her hand with a firm grip that suggested both strength and stress. "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did out there." Devon stood awkwardly, the space blanket falling away as he shook her hand. "Is she okay?" "She'll be fine. Complete recovery expected within a few days. But the doctors said—" Catherine Laurent paused, emotion threatening to crack the composed facade she'd maintained. "They said she could have died if she hadn't received immediate help. That heat stroke can cause permanent organ damage if not treated quickly. I'm glad she's okay. What you did, stopping when you were so close to winning, that's not normal. Most people wouldn't have made that choice." Devon glanced at Coach Henderson, who was listening with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for discussing race strategy. "Most people aren't in that situation. My husband and I would like to speak with you when you're feeling better. We have some things we'd like to discuss." "About what?" Catherine Laurent smiled for the first time since approaching them. "About the future. About recognizing character when we see it. About making sure that doing the right thing doesn't cost you the opportunities you've earned." She handed Devon a business card. Heavy paper stock with raised lettering that spoke of serious money and significant influence. "Take some time to process today. Rest, recover, spend time with your family. But call us next week. We have a proposition that might interest you." After she left, Devon studied the card. Laurent Capital Management. Catherine M. Laurent, managing partner. An address in downtown Chicago that he recognized as being in the financial district where buildings cost more per square foot than his family spent on rent per year. "What do you think that's about?" he asked Coach Henderson. "I think," the coach said slowly, "that you're about to learn something about the difference between winning races and winning respect." Devon's family found him 20 minutes later, navigating through the crowd with the kind of determined effort that suggested they'd been searching for a while. His mother reached him first, wrapping him in a hug that conveyed months of worry, pride, and relief in a single embrace. "We watched on the big screen," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Saw you leading, saw you stop, saw you help that girl. Baby, we've never been prouder." "I didn't win, Mama." "You did something better than winning." Marcus and Keisha arrived. Moments later, both trying to play it cool, but obviously excited by the attention their brother was receiving from the media and other runners. Marcus wore a Team Devon t-shirt that someone in the family had made, while Keisha carried a homemade sign that read, "South Side Speed Demon." "That was crazy," Marcus said, his teenage attempt at nonchalance undermined by the wide grin he couldn't suppress. "People around us were going nuts when they saw you turn around. Jerome's mom was crying," Keisha added. "Said she'd never seen anything like it." They spent the next hour in the recovery area, sharing stories about the race from both sides of the course barriers. Devon learned that his family had tracked his progress through the early miles, cheering at multiple points along the route. They'd watched his surge to the front of the pack, witnessed his approach to victory, and observed his choice to help a fallen competitor. "The announcer didn't know what to make of it at first," his mother explained. "Kept saying there must be some mistake, that the leader wouldn't just stop running. But then they figured out what happened, and the whole crowd was cheering for you, even though I didn't win. Especially because you didn't win." As the afternoon wore on and the recovery area began to empty, Devon felt the physical and emotional exhaustion of the day settling into his bones. His legs ached with the specific soreness that came from running farther than the human body was designed to travel in a single effort. His mind struggled to process the complex mixture of achievement and disappointment that defined his race experience. But underneath the fatigue and confusion, something else was taking root, a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with finishing, times or medal placement. He'd faced the defining moment of his athletic career and chosen character over competition. Whether that choice would ultimately benefit or harm his future remained unclear, but the decision itself felt unshakably right. Dr. Patricia Mills appeared as they prepared to leave, her pediatrician's eye immediately assessing Devon's post-race condition. "How are you feeling?" she asked, the question carrying professional as well as personal concern. "Tired but good. Thank you for making this possible. Thank you for making it meaningful." She handed him an envelope. "I wanted you to have this, regardless of how the race turned out." Inside was a check for $500 and a note. "For someone who understands that victory isn't always about crossing the finish line first. Use this for whatever you need most." Devon stared at the check, understanding that it represented groceries for his family, help with bills that were always overdue, maybe even the start of a college fund that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. "Dr. Mills, I can't. You can and you will. What you did today reminded everyone watching that sports can be about more than winning and losing. That alone is worth far more than $500. The drive home felt different than the morning journey to Grant Park. Then, Devon had been carrying the weight of expectations and the pressure of months of preparation. Now, exhausted but somehow lighter, he watched Chicago pass outside the car window with new eyes. The city looked the same. The lake still stretched to the horizon. The skyline still pierced the sky with towers of steel and glass. The neighborhood still displayed the visible markers of economic inequality that divided opportunity along clear geographic lines. But something in Devon's relationship to it all had shifted. He was no longer just a kid from the South Side who ran fast. He was someone who'd been tested at the highest level of competition and discovered something valuable about his own character. Win or lose, that knowledge was his to keep. "You hungry?" his mother asked as they pulled into their neighborhood. "Starving?" "Good. Mrs. Thompson made a celebration dinner. Win or lose. Says the whole block's been following your training and they want to show their appreciation." Devon looked out at the familiar streets where he'd logged thousands of training miles. The cracked sidewalks that had taught him to watch his footing, the corner where Mr. Thompson sold newspapers and offered encouragement to anyone willing to work hard for their dreams. This was home. Not just the apartment where his family lived, but the community that had supported his unlikely journey from warehouse worker to elite marathon competitor. These people had cheered for him not because they expected him to win, but because he represented the possibility that circumstances of birth didn't determine limits of achievement. As Coach Henderson pulled up to the apartment building, Devon could see lights on in windows that normally stayed dark to save electricity. Tonight, his community was celebrating not his victory, but his courage, and perhaps more importantly, the example he'd set about choosing character over personal gain. "Ready for this?" Coach Henderson asked, nodding toward the building where sounds of a gathering drifted through open windows. Devon smiled, feeling genuinely happy for the first time since crossing the finish line. "Yeah, I'm ready." Tomorrow would bring decisions about college, career, and the uncertain future that awaited someone who'd gain national attention for an act of athletic sportsmanship. Tonight was for celebration with the people who'd believed in him from the beginning, who'd supported his dreams without expecting anything in return, who understood that some victories had nothing to do with finishing first. He climbed out of the car, medal still around his neck, and headed toward a homecoming that felt better than any podium ceremony could have provided. 3 days after the marathon, Devon sat in the gleaming conference room of Laurent Capital Management, wearing Coach Henderson's borrowed dress shirt. Across the mahogany table sat Catherine and Richard Laurent, whose presence commanded respect without effort. "Before we begin," Catherine said, sliding an envelope across the table, "Stephanie is doing well, full recovery. She asked me to give you this Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for saving my life. I've never met anyone with your kind of character. I hope we can race against each other again someday." "Stephanie, what you did," Richard said, leaning forward, "sacrificing certain victory to help a stranger. That's not common. Your instincts chose compassion over personal gain. That tells us everything about your character." Catherine opened a leather portfolio. "We'd like to make you an offer, actually several offers," Richard explained with smooth efficiency. "Full academic scholarship to Northwestern University where you can continue running. We're also establishing a foundation for youth athletics in underserved communities. We want you as our first recipient and eventually help identify other young athletes facing similar challenges." Devon stared at the documents. Everything he'd worked toward being offered because he'd chosen to help someone in distress. "Why me?" he asked finally. "We've spent years looking for young people who embody values we want to support." Catherine replied, "Academic achievement is important, athletic talent is valuable, but character is rare. If I hadn't stopped to help Stephanie, would we be having this conversation?" Richard considered it seriously. "Probably not. Winners get attention and sponsorship, but they don't necessarily get long-term investment in character development." "What about Coach Henderson?" Richard smiled. "We'd like to offer him director of coaching for our youth foundation. Better salary, chance to work with talented athletes across the region, resources he's never had access to." At dinner that evening, Devon presented the offer to his family around their small kitchen table. "Full scholarship to Northwestern," his mother repeated, disbelieving. "That's one of the best schools in the country. And they want to help us too," Devon explained the financial support that would transform their family's stability. "What's the catch?" Keisha asked practically. "No catch. They just want me to be myself and help other kids get similar opportunities." 3 weeks later, Devon stood on Northwestern's track for his first collegiate practice. The facility was everything he'd imagined: perfect surfaces, state-of-the-art equipment, elite coaches. But as he laced up the same racing flats Dr. Mills had given him, Devon realized the most important elements hadn't changed. Discipline, mental toughness, and satisfaction from gradual improvement remained constant. Coach Henderson had accepted the foundation position, already working to identify promising young athletes. Their first recruit was a 15-year-old girl from Detroit whose marathon potential was obvious, but whose family couldn't afford competition travel. "Full circle," Coach Henderson said, "using what you learned to help others learn the same lessons." 6 months later, Devon received a text from Stephanie Laurent. "Boston Marathon next year. You in?" he showed Coach Henderson during their weekly meeting. "What do you think?" Devon asked. "I think you got unfinished business with that distance." "Think I can win this time?" "I think you already did." Devon headed out for his afternoon run, carrying him toward a future built not on a single victory, but on countless small choices to prioritize character over convenience, compassion over competition. Sometimes the most important victories happened when nobody was keeping score, and sometimes losing a race was just the beginning of winning something far more valuable. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.